Week 22. Last week, there was a lot of bug squashing. Now, I didn't realize how many bugs there were in the app, but I discovered a lot of them. I fixed a lot of them, but there's sure to be many more to be discovered and fixed. So that'll be the focus for the next couple of weeks, including the alpha testing period. That's the goal of alpha testing. And I also need to actually seriously consider actually adding tests to the app. Currently, the test coverage is 0%, but I'll worry about that a little bit later. The most important contribution that I did to my app in the last week was version control in my backend, specifically the Supabase Edge functions, as well as the Supabase Postgres database and all the associated database functions, triggers, and schemas and whatnot. Now, it actually took quite a bit of learning. One of the biggest reasons of the hesitation originally for version controlling the backend is that there's not really a very clean way of doing it. If you think about it, the regular version control for your app or for any type of application is fairly straightforward. You use Git, who doesn't use Git nowadays, and you just commit your code files into a repository, and then Git will sort of, take care of the version control for you. And if you run into any issues, you roll back. That's easy peasy. The biggest reason that this can be done is that your code, the Git version control of the code is declarative. Now understand that the code most developers write would be actually imperative. You tell the application what to do. But as far as Git is concerned, if you think about it, your code is actually declarative. You declare to Git where you want a particular file to be and what the content of that particular file to be, right? So for Git, you're declaring the files, the positions, the locations, the paths, the directories to it. And Git can sort of easily version control those things. For data, I discovered that for database and mostly for databases, Edge functions, you can still use a declarative paradigm to use Git version control for it fairly straightforwardly. But for databases, particularly for Postgres databases, you cannot do that. There's no easy declarative way of declaring schemas, triggers, constraints, views in a database. You have to use something called a migration file, or plural, migration files. And these things are not declarative. They're imperative. In other words, every migration file is a series of instructions, mostly in SQL commands, to the database backend to perform a series of functions to hopefully get the database to a state that you want it to be. And I think this was what sort of tripped me up a big time and gave me the hesitation to version control the backend that I have. Up until this moment, I've been raw dogging it, just issuing SQL commands directly in the console to change anything in the database. But as I'm nearing alpha testing, I'm beginning to realize the importance of actually not doing that. Specifically, as I'm squashing bugs, you don't want to introduce regression and then have more and more issues come up, and you don't have a way of rolling back to a previous installation or previous state of the database. Anyway, so that's done. The untamed backend of my app is now finally version controlled. So that was the accomplishment for last week. A lot of bug fixes, and most importantly, version controlling the backend. For the next week, it will be an abbreviated week, but most of the focus would still be on bug squashing. I already know a couple of them that I need to squash, and that will be the focus, and hopefully polishing up a certain aspect of the subscription interactions with the customers. And that'll be that for next week. I'll see you next week then.